The Colonel's mission. Colonel James stood in front of the mirror, adjusting his uniform for the last time. Today was not just another day. It was a mission filled with honor and sadness. He was tasked with escorting the remains of Sergeant David, a young soldier who had given his life for his country. As he straightened his collar, he thought about the weight of his responsibility. This was not only a duty but also a way to pay respect to a fallen hero. He took a deep breath and reminded himself of the importance of this day. Colonel James had served in the military for over 20 years. He had seen many battles, faced many challenges, and lost many friends. Each loss was hard, but this mission felt different. He had known Sergeant David personally. The young man was filled with dreams and a bright future, and it pained James to think that those dreams had been cut short. Today, he would bring David home. As he made his way to the airport, he couldn't help but feel a mix of pride and sorrow. He drove through the busy streets, watching people go about their daily lives. Some were laughing, others were arguing, but James felt distant from it all. He was focused on his mission, determined to ensure that David received the honor he deserved. Arriving at the airport, Colonel James parked his car and walked toward the entrance. The terminal was bustling with people. Families were greeting each other, and travelers were rushing to catch their flights. James felt a pang of sadness. While everyone else was filled with joy, he was about to say goodbye to another brave soldier. As he walked through the terminal, he noticed the flags hanging proudly. They reminded him of the sacrifices made by those who served their country. James approached the check-in counter, where a young woman greeted him with a smile. "Good morning, sir. How can I assist you today?" she asked cheerfully. "I'm here to escort the remains of Sergeant David," he replied, his voice steady. "I need to check in for my flight." The woman's expression changed slightly. "I'll need to check our system," she said, tapping on her keyboard. A moment later, her smile faded. "I'm sorry, sir, but it looks like we are overbooked for this flight." Colonel James felt a wave of frustration wash over him. "This is a military escort," he insisted. "It's important that I board this flight." "I understand, but there is nothing I can do." "The flight is full," she replied, her tone more apologetic now. James took a deep breath, trying to remain calm. "You don't understand," he said firmly. "This isn't just about me. I'm bringing back the remains of a fallen soldier. He deserves to be treated with respect." The woman glanced around, clearly uncomfortable. "I wish I could help, but the system won't allow it. Maybe you can take another flight." James felt his heart sink. He had no time to wait for another flight. The soldier's family was expecting him. "Can I speak to a supervisor?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady. A few minutes later, a man in a suit approached. He looked important, but he also seemed rushed. "What seems to be the problem?" he asked, not looking James in the eye. "This colonel is claiming a military escort," the woman explained, "but we don't have room on the flight." The man finally turned to James. "I understand, but there's really nothing we can do." "We are fully booked," he said dismissively. Colonel James felt anger rising within him. "You don't understand what this means," he said, trying to keep his emotions in check. "This isn't just a body. This is a hero, a man who fought for our country. You should be honored to help bring him home." The supervisor shrugged, uninterested. "I'm sorry, but rules are rules." James stepped back, trying to process the situation. He looked around the terminal, watching other passengers board the plane without a care. He felt a deep sense of betrayal. How could they treat a soldier like this? He turned back to the supervisor, determination in his eyes. "I will not let this go. I will find a way to get on that flight." After what felt like an eternity, James took a seat in the waiting area, his heart heavy. He pulled out his phone and called his superior officer, General Anderson. He explained the situation, his voice thick with emotion. The general listened carefully, and after a moment, he said, "I'll make some calls, Colonel. We'll get you on that flight. Don't worry." Hanging up, James felt a little relief. But as he looked around the terminal, he still felt a deep sadness. This was not just about him. It was about the fallen soldier and his family. He thought of Sergeant David's mother, waiting for her son to come home. How could he tell her that her son was being disrespected even in death? Suddenly, the overhead announcement broke his thoughts. We apologize for the inconvenience, but due to a delay, boarding for Flight 567 will begin shortly. James's heart raced. He knew he had to be ready. He stood up, straightened his uniform, and prepared to fight for what was right. He would not let anyone disrespect Sergeant David's memory. As he waited, he vowed that he would make sure this soldier would get the honor he deserved, no matter what it took. In that moment, Colonel James knew this mission was not just about escorting a body. It was about standing up for justice, respect, and honor. He would not back down. Not today. A fight for honor. Colonel James paced the waiting area, feeling the weight of the world on his shoulders. Every second felt like an eternity as he thought of Sergeant David's family. They were counting on him to bring their son home with dignity, and he couldn't let them down. He clenched his fists, determined to fight for what was right. After a few tense moments, General Anderson called back. "Colonel, I've spoken to the airline's management. They will accommodate you and the remains. You need to head to the private boarding area immediately," he said, his voice firm. James felt a rush of gratitude. "Thank you, sir. I'm on my way." With renewed determination, he made his way through the terminal, passing bewildered travelers and busy airport staff. He ignored the curious glances and focused solely on his mission. As he approached the private boarding area, he noticed a small crowd gathered outside, whispering among themselves. James took a deep breath and stepped forward. A security officer stood at the entrance, blocking the way. "Sorry, sir, this area is restricted," the officer said. "I'm Colonel James," he replied, holding his military ID firmly in hand. "I'm here to escort Sergeant David's remains. I have permission from the general." The officer hesitated, glancing at the crowd before letting James through. As he walked past, he heard the whispers. "Who does he think he is? They shouldn't give him special treatment." The words stung, but James pushed the negativity aside. He had a mission, and he couldn't let anything distract him. Inside the private area, a few airline staff members were waiting. The mood was tense. "Colonel, we sincerely apologize for the earlier misunderstanding," said one woman, her voice shaky. "We appreciate your service and understand the importance of this mission." James nodded, but his expression remained stern. "It's not just about me. It's about respecting our fallen soldiers. We cannot allow disrespect to overshadow their sacrifices." The staff exchanged worried looks. They knew how significant this situation was, and James's words made them uneasy. "We have arranged for the remains to be placed in the cargo hold safely. You will board before the other passengers," another staff member assured him. "Thank you," James replied, though he couldn't shake the unease in his stomach. He watched as they prepared the remains for boarding. This was the moment he had been waiting for, yet it felt surreal. After a few minutes, they began to load the casket. James stood at attention, his heart heavy. He remembered the day he met Sergeant David. The young soldier was enthusiastic, full of life, and had dreams of becoming a leader one day. How could someone so full of promise be gone so soon? Once everything was ready, they led him to the boarding area. The atmosphere was different now. As passengers began to board, some noticed James in uniform and the casket being loaded. A few approached him, expressions of respect on their faces. "Thank you for your service, sir," one woman said, her voice sincere. "We appreciate what you're doing." James nodded, feeling a swell of pride. Maybe not everyone shared the same prejudices. Some people truly understood the importance of honoring a fallen hero. As more passengers boarded, he felt the tide turning in his favor. But just as he was about to step onto the plane, he overheard a conversation that made his blood boil. A man in a business suit was talking to his friend. "I don't get why they have to make such a big deal about it. He's just a soldier," he scoffed. James's heart raced, and he turned around, unable to hold back. "Excuse me," he said, his voice steady yet full of authority. "That soldier you're dismissing is someone's son, brother, and friend. He sacrificed everything for our freedom. You should show respect." The man looked taken aback. "I didn't mean—" "No, you didn't. But it's time you recognize the truth. Without people like Sergeant David, you wouldn't have the life you live. Think about that before you speak again." James snapped, his anger boiling over. A few other passengers around them began to nod in agreement, murmuring their support. The man quickly backed down, realizing he had crossed a line. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to offend," he mumbled before quickly moving away. James took a deep breath, feeling the tension in the air shift. He had made a stand, and it felt good to defend David's honor. This was not just about one soldier. It was about all those who had served and sacrificed. Finally, it was time to board the plane. As James stepped inside, he felt a wave of relief wash over him. He was fulfilling his duty, and nothing would stop him now. He took a seat near the front, ensuring he could keep an eye on the casket in the cargo hold. As the plane prepared for takeoff, James reflected on the day's events. He had faced disrespect and ignorance, but he also felt a growing sense of support from others. It reminded him that there were still people who understood the sacrifices made by soldiers. The plane's engines roared to life, and James closed his eyes for a moment, focusing on his mission. He would not let the journey end in sadness. He would ensure that Sergeant David was honored every step of the way. As the plane ascended into the sky, he made a silent promise to the young soldier: "I will bring you home with the dignity you deserve." With that thought in mind, Colonel James prepared for the next leg of the journey, knowing that the fight for honor was far from over. The journey begins. The plane soared high above the clouds, leaving the chaos of the airport far behind. Colonel James stared out of the window, watching the patchwork of fields and towns below slowly fade away. He felt a mix of emotions swirling within him: sadness for Sergeant David's family, pride in serving his country, and anger at the disrespect he had encountered. Each feeling weighed heavily on his heart. As the flight attendants moved through the cabin, offering drinks and snacks, James kept his focus on the cargo hold. He knew that inside was the casket of a brave young soldier, and he couldn't shake the feeling of responsibility that came with it. David had given everything for his country, and now it was up to James to ensure he received the honor he deserved. After a short while, a soft voice interrupted his thoughts. "Excuse me, Colonel." A woman sitting across the aisle had caught his attention. She was in her 30s with kind eyes and a look of concern. "I heard what you said earlier. Thank you for standing up for that soldier. It takes courage to speak out like that." James nodded, grateful for her words. "Thank you, ma'am. It's important to remember those who have sacrificed. We owe them that much." She smiled, her expression sincere. "My brother served in the military. I understand how vital it is to honor their memory." James felt a connection with her, recognizing the shared respect for service members. They exchanged a few more words about their experiences, which brought a sense of comfort to James. It reminded him that even amidst ignorance, there were people who understood the weight of sacrifice. As the flight continued, he noticed a shift in the atmosphere. Passengers who had previously whispered and laughed were now more somber. Many had seen the casket being loaded, and some seemed to be reflecting on their own lives and choices. An hour into the flight, the captain announced, "Ladies and gentlemen, we have a special guest on board today. Colonel James is escorting the remains of Sergeant David, who made the ultimate sacrifice for our country. We thank him for his service and invite everyone to honor Sergeant David's memory." A ripple of applause broke out in the cabin. James's heart swelled with pride. He hadn't expected such a gesture, but it felt good to see the passengers recognizing the soldier's sacrifice. The woman who had spoken to him earlier clapped the loudest, her eyes shining with respect. After the applause faded, a young man stood up, his hands shaking slightly. "I just want to say thank you, Colonel. I know it's not much, but we really appreciate what you and Sergeant David have done for us." James felt a warmth spread through the cabin. More passengers began to share their thoughts, expressing gratitude and admiration for the military and those who served. It was a heartwarming moment that transformed the flight into something more than just a journey. It was a shared experience, a collective acknowledgement of sacrifice and bravery. As the flight continued, Colonel James made his way to the back of the plane, where he could speak with passengers. Many approached him, sharing stories about their loved ones who had served in the military. Some had family members who had made the ultimate sacrifice, while others simply wanted to express their support for the troops. One elderly man with a cap that read Vietnam Veteran approached him. "I served many years ago, Colonel," he said, his voice strong but filled with emotion. "And I know how important it is to honor our fallen. Thank you for bringing David home. It means a lot." James felt honored to hear the man's words. "Thank you for your service as well, sir. It's a duty I take very seriously." After a while, he returned to his seat, feeling uplifted by the connections he had made. The flight was no longer just a means to an end. It was a journey filled with respect, remembrance, and camaraderie. Each story shared had strengthened the bond between the passengers, united by a common goal: to honor Sergeant David. As they neared their destination, the cabin grew quieter. Passengers seemed lost in thought, reflecting on the day's events and the meaning of sacrifice. Colonel James felt a sense of peace wash over him. He knew that David would not be forgotten. His legacy would live on in the hearts of those who appreciated the sacrifices made for freedom. When the plane finally landed, a somber atmosphere filled the cabin. The passengers prepared to disembark, but James noticed many taking a moment to gather their thoughts before leaving. He stood and faced the passengers, wanting to express his gratitude. "Thank you all for your kindness and respect today. It means more than you can know. Sergeant David fought for this country, and he fought for all of you. Please remember him and all the brave souls who serve." With that, he stepped off the plane, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. The airport was bustling with activity, but James's mind was focused on the task ahead. He was one step closer to fulfilling his promise to David's family. As he walked toward the exit, he spotted a group of military personnel waiting for him. Their presence brought him comfort, knowing that he wasn't alone in this mission. Together, they would escort Sergeant David home with the dignity and honor he deserved. Colonel James took a deep breath, ready to face the next chapter of this journey. The fight for honor would continue, and he was determined to make sure that everyone remembered the sacrifice of Sergeant David. He was not just escorting a soldier, he was carrying the weight of a nation's gratitude and respect. The unforeseen consequences. Colonel James stepped off the plane, his heart heavy yet resolute. He looked around the bustling airport, filled with people rushing to their destinations, unaware of the solemn mission he was on. As he walked toward the baggage claim, he felt the weight of Sergeant David's casket on his shoulders. It was a reminder of the soldier's sacrifice, and he was determined to see it through to the end. Waiting for him at the terminal was a group of military personnel, their expressions a mix of respect and solidarity. They greeted him with salutes, acknowledging the gravity of the situation. James felt a swell of pride and gratitude for the camaraderie they shared. They were united in honoring a fallen brother, and together they would ensure David received the tribute he deserved. "Colonel, we're ready for you," said Sergeant Thompson, a young man with bright eyes and a sense of determination. "The family is waiting for you outside. They need our support." James nodded, appreciating the support of his fellow soldiers. "Thank you, Sergeant. Let's make sure we do this right." As they made their way to the exit, Colonel James could see the family gathered outside. A small group stood together, their faces marked by grief and uncertainty. David's mother, a woman with kind eyes and a heartbroken expression, clutched a framed photograph of her son. The sight of her anguish pierced James's heart, reminding him of the personal cost of war. When they reached the family, James took a moment to compose himself. "Mrs. Johnson," he began, his voice steady yet compassionate, "I'm Colonel James. I'm here to bring your son home. We will make sure he is honored today." Mrs. Johnson looked up, tears shimmering in her eyes. "Thank you, Colonel. He meant everything to us. I just can't believe he's gone." James felt a lump in his throat. He was a brave soldier, and he fought for all of us. You should be proud. The family nodded, their expressions filled with both sorrow and pride. The atmosphere was heavy with emotion, and James knew this was just the beginning of a long day. They needed to prepare for the arrival of David's casket, and he wanted to make sure everything was in place. As they escorted the family to the designated area, James noticed more people gathering. Friends, neighbors, and fellow soldiers began to show their support, standing together in solidarity. It was heartwarming to see the community come together, but he also sensed a tension in the air. Something felt off, and he couldn't shake the feeling that they were not alone. Once they reached the area where the casket would be displayed, James turned to the family. "We will honor David with a ceremony and provide him with the respect he deserves. You are not alone. We are here for you." Suddenly, a commotion erupted at the entrance of the airport. A group of protesters had gathered, holding signs that read, "End the war" and "Stop the violence." Their voices rose above the crowd, drowning out the solemn atmosphere. James's heart sank as he realized this was not the time for such divisive actions. The military personnel exchanged worried glances. James stepped forward, determined to maintain control of the situation. "We need to keep this respectful," he said firmly to his fellow soldiers. "We cannot let this turn into chaos." As he approached the protesters, he raised his hands, trying to calm the situation. "Ladies and gentlemen, I understand your frustrations, but today is not about politics. We are here to honor a fallen soldier and support his family. Please, let us have this moment of respect." Some of the protesters seemed taken aback, recognizing the gravity of the situation. However, others shouted louder, their anger spilling over. "This is wrong. We need to make a statement." James felt a surge of frustration, but remained composed. "I hear you, but right now, a mother is mourning her son. Let's not turn this into a conflict. This is about remembering Sergeant David's sacrifice." Just then, Mrs. Johnson stepped forward, her voice breaking through the chaos. "My son died fighting for our freedom. I understand you have your views, but today is about him. Please let us remember him in peace." Her words hung in the air, momentarily silencing the crowd. James watched as the protesters shifted uneasily, their anger tempered by the raw emotion of a grieving mother. Slowly, some of them lowered their signs, and a few began to back away. The tension in the air eased slightly, and James felt a flicker of hope. Perhaps this moment of honesty could bridge the divide, if only for a little while. After a few tense moments, the protesters began to disperse, recognizing the solemnity of the occasion. James breathed a sigh of relief, grateful that Mrs. Johnson's heartfelt plea had made a difference. With the crowd finally settling down, James returned to the family, who looked shaken but relieved. "Thank you, Colonel," Mrs. Johnson said, her voice trembling. "It's hard to see such anger when we just want to honor David." James nodded, his heart heavy for the family. "I will do everything in my power to ensure he is honored today. You are not alone in this." As they prepared for the ceremony, the atmosphere shifted again, this time filled with solemnity and respect. The community came together, standing united to pay tribute to a fallen hero. James felt a renewed sense of purpose, knowing that despite the challenges, they would honor David's legacy and make sure his sacrifice would never be forgotten. As the sun began to set, casting a golden hue across the sky, Colonel James knew this was just the beginning. The journey to honor Sergeant David was far from over, but today they would celebrate his life and the bravery that defined him. The ceremony of honor. The sun dipped low on the horizon, casting a warm glow over the gathering as Colonel James prepared for the ceremony. The air was thick with emotion, and a palpable sense of reverence enveloped the crowd. Family, friends, and fellow soldiers stood together, united in their shared grief and determination to honor Sergeant David's sacrifice. As the military band began to play, the sound of the solemn notes filled the air, reminding everyone of the significance of the day. James stood at the front, his heart pounding in his chest. He took a deep breath, knowing that this moment was crucial for the family and everyone present. He wanted to ensure it would be a day they would remember, not just for the pain of loss, but for the honor of service. "Ladies and gentlemen," James began, his voice steady and clear, "we are gathered here today to honor a true hero, Sergeant David Johnson. He fought bravely for our country, and today we pay tribute to his life, his service, and the sacrifices he made." As he spoke, he could see Mrs. Johnson clutching the framed photograph of her son, her eyes glistening with tears. James felt a wave of compassion for her, knowing that words could never fully convey the depth of their loss. Still, he pressed on, determined to honor David's memory with heartfelt words. David was more than a soldier. He was a son, a brother, and a friend. He stood for what was right, and he fought for those who could not fight for themselves. His courage and selflessness will forever be remembered in our hearts. The crowd listened intently, some nodding in agreement, others wiping away tears. The gravity of James's words resonated deeply, reminding them all of the cost of freedom. As he concluded his speech, James stepped back, allowing the family to share their thoughts. Mrs. Johnson approached the microphone, her hands trembling slightly. "Thank you all for being here," she began, her voice breaking. "David was my everything. He had a heart of gold and always put others before himself. He wanted to make the world a better place, and I am so proud of him." The crowd was silent, the only sound being the soft rustle of the wind. Mrs. Johnson's words hung in the air, a testament to her son's spirit. James felt a surge of admiration for her strength in such a difficult moment. "I know David is watching over us," she continued, her voice gaining strength. "He loved this country and would want us to come together, to support one another. Let us not forget the values he fought for." As she spoke, James noticed a young boy in the crowd, tears streaming down his cheeks. He couldn't have been more than 8 or 9 years old. The boy held a small toy soldier tightly in his hand, and James's heart ached for him. He understood that this boy had lost a hero in his life, someone he would never have the chance to know. After Mrs. Johnson finished speaking, James took a moment to collect his thoughts. He wanted to ensure that the ceremony would resonate with everyone present, especially the younger generation who needed to understand the importance of sacrifice and honor. "Today, we remember not just Sergeant David Johnson, but all the brave men and women who have fought for our freedom," he said, his voice ringing with conviction. "Let us teach the next generation about courage, compassion, and the true meaning of service." With that, he turned to the military personnel gathered behind him, signaling them to prepare for the next part of the ceremony. The honor guard moved forward, carefully bringing forth David's casket. The band played a solemn rendition of taps, a haunting melody that resonated through the air, sending chills down everyone's spine. As the casket was positioned in front of the crowd, James took a step back, allowing the family to approach. Mrs. Johnson, alongside her family, placed flowers on the casket, each blossom representing their love and memories of David. It was a powerful moment, filled with love, loss, and hope. As the ceremony progressed, several soldiers took turns sharing stories about David, each tale revealing his humor, kindness, and unwavering dedication. Laughter mingled with tears as they recounted his antics during training, the way he always lifted spirits, and how he had a knack for making everyone feel included. The atmosphere shifted from somber to celebratory, a fitting tribute to a life well lived. James stood at the back, watching the crowd come together in solidarity. This was what David had fought for, a community united in love and respect. As the ceremony drew to a close, James looked up at the sky, noticing the first stars beginning to twinkle against the darkening canvas. He felt a sense of peace wash over him, knowing that David's legacy would live on in the hearts of those gathered. Let us not forget the bravery of Sergeant David Johnson. He said one last time, his voice ringing with sincerity. May we honor him in our actions and carry his spirit with us always. The crowd erupted into applause, a wave of gratitude and respect washing over the ceremony. People began to embrace one another, sharing stories, laughter, and tears, creating a bond that would last long after the day was over. As Colonel James stepped away from the crowd, he felt a sense of fulfillment. Though the day had started with tension and uncertainty, it had transformed into a celebration of life and courage. David's memory would not fade. It would continue to inspire others, reminding them of the power of unity and love. With the stars shining brightly above, James knew that together they would carry forward the message of honor, ensuring that Sergeant David Johnson would never be forgotten. The journey was far from over, but today they had taken an important step toward healing. The reckoning. In the days following the ceremony, Colonel James felt a mix of relief and heaviness. The emotional weight of honoring Sergeant David Johnson had taken its toll, but he was determined to ensure that the events surrounding David's death did not go unnoticed. The callousness shown by the airline and the authorities was still fresh in his mind, and he knew he had to act. James gathered a group of fellow officers and veterans at a local diner one evening. The place was buzzing with activity, but the corner booth they occupied felt like a world apart. They discussed David's story, the injustices faced by the family, and how they could bring attention to the issue of respect for fallen soldiers. Something needs to be done, James said firmly, leaning forward. What happened to David should never happen again. We need to raise awareness and make sure that every soldier, every hero, is treated with the dignity they deserve. The group nodded in agreement, each member sharing their own stories of disrespect faced during their service. A retired sergeant spoke up, his voice laced with passion. We fought for our country, and we should be honored for it. This isn't just about David. It's about every soldier who has been overlooked or disrespected. As the night progressed, they brainstormed ways to highlight their cause. They considered organizing a rally, reaching out to local media, and sharing their stories online. James took charge, determined to lead the effort to shine a light on the disrespect shown to service members. Let's gather as many people as we can, James urged. We can create a movement to honor all soldiers and demand accountability from those who fail to respect their sacrifices. As the plans took shape, the atmosphere in the diner shifted. What started as a small gathering transformed into a determined coalition of veterans and community members, all united by a common goal. They began to spread the word, creating flyers, setting up social media pages, and reaching out to local news outlets. As the days turned into weeks, the movement gained momentum. James became a familiar face at local events, speaking about the importance of honoring soldiers and ensuring that their sacrifices were recognized. The support from the community grew, and more people began to share their own stories of service and the lack of respect they had encountered. One day, a local news station reached out to James for an interview. They wanted to cover the story of David and the movement that had sprung from it. James felt a mixture of nerves and excitement. This was his chance to bring the issue to a wider audience. During the interview, James spoke passionately about David's legacy. He shared the story of how David was denied his right to a respectful farewell and how that event sparked a call for change. Every soldier deserves to be honored, not just for their service, but for the sacrifices they and their families make, he stated, his voice steady and clear. As the interview aired, the response from the public was overwhelming. People flooded social media with messages of support, sharing their own experiences and standing in solidarity with the cause. Many veterans reached out to James, expressing their gratitude for bringing attention to the issue. However, not everyone was supportive. Some individuals, including representatives from the airline involved, began to push back. They issued statements defending their actions, insisting that protocols were followed, and downplaying the outrage. James knew they would face resistance, But he also understood the importance of perseverance. He continued to speak out, urging the community to stand firm and demand accountability. The movement became a rallying point, encouraging others to share their stories and stand up against disrespect towards service members. As time passed, James received a phone call that would change everything. It was from a national news network, wanting to cover the story on a larger scale. They had seen the movement's impact and wanted to highlight the push for change and honoring fallen soldiers. James couldn't believe it. This was a chance to reach millions of viewers and amplify their message. He immediately gathered his team, and they began preparing for the upcoming segment. They wanted to ensure that David's story would resonate with viewers everywhere. The day of the filming arrived, and James stood in front of the cameras, flanked by fellow veterans and David's family. He felt a surge of energy as he spoke about their cause, emphasizing the need for respect and honor for every soldier who had served. David's story is not just his own. It represents countless others who have faced disrespect in their time of need. James said passionately, "We are here to demand change, to ensure that no soldier is ever overlooked again. We owe it to our heroes, and we owe it to their families." As the cameras rolled, the audience could feel the sincerity and urgency in James's voice. He shared stories of sacrifice, courage, and the pain of losing a loved one while being denied dignity. It was a powerful moment that left an impression on everyone watching. After the segment aired, the response was tremendous. Social media exploded with support, and people from all walks of life began sharing the hashtag associated with the movement. James felt a sense of hope as he watched the momentum build. The movement was gaining traction, and more importantly, it was becoming a platform for change. Organizations began reaching out, expressing interest in collaborating to honor fallen soldiers properly. James knew that this was just the beginning. As they moved forward, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. The fight for respect and dignity for all service members was far from over, but they were making progress. The community was rallying together, and David's legacy was inspiring a wave of change. The fight for justice had brought the community closer, and James was determined to see it through. As he looked ahead, he knew that with every step, they were honoring not just David but all those who had given their lives for the country. They would not rest until every soldier was treated with the respect they deserved. A new dawn. As the movement continued to gain momentum, Colonel James felt an overwhelming sense of pride. What began as a small group of veterans united by their shared experiences had blossomed into a nationwide campaign advocating for the respect and honor of all soldiers. The community's response was heartening. People were sharing their stories, holding vigils, and wearing pins that symbolized support for fallen heroes. One day, as James was reviewing social media posts about the movement, he received a surprising message. It was from a well-known political figure who had seen the recent news coverage. They wanted to meet and discuss how they could support the cause on a national level. James felt a rush of excitement. This was the opportunity they needed to take their message to the halls of power. The meeting was set for the following week in Washington, D.C. James was filled with anticipation and nerves. He knew this was a chance to advocate for real change and to honor David's memory in a way that could resonate across the country. He gathered his team, and they began preparing their presentation, outlining key points and stories that highlighted the importance of treating every soldier with dignity. On the day of the meeting, James and his team arrived at the Capitol. As they walked through the marble hallways, he couldn't help but feel a sense of history. These walls had seen countless discussions about rights and justice. Today, they would be a part of that legacy. When they entered the meeting room, they were greeted by the politician and several aides. James introduced himself and his team, and they began sharing their mission. They spoke passionately about the experiences of soldiers like David, who had been disrespected in their time of grief. They highlighted the need for systemic changes in how the military and the public honored their fallen heroes. As they spoke, the politician listened intently. When it was time for questions, she leaned forward, her expression serious. "What specific changes are you advocating for?" she asked. James took a deep breath, knowing this was a pivotal moment. "We believe there should be a national policy that ensures every fallen soldier receives the honor and respect they deserve, no matter the circumstances. This includes proper transportation for their remains, recognition during memorial services, and public awareness campaigns to educate people about the sacrifices these soldiers make." The room fell silent as everyone absorbed his words. After a moment, the politician nodded. "I agree that this is an important issue. I can help you bring this to the floor of Congress. We need to make this a priority." James felt a wave of relief and hope wash over him. They had taken a significant step forward, and he was determined to see it through. The meeting wrapped up with plans to draft a proposal for new legislation that would protect the rights and dignity of fallen soldiers. In the following weeks, the movement gained even more traction. News outlets began to cover their efforts, and public interest swelled. Social media campaigns spread like wildfire, with hashtags trending and thousands of people sharing their support. James was invited to speak at rallies and events across the country. Each time he stepped onto the stage, he felt the weight of responsibility, but also the support of everyone behind him. With every story he shared about David and others, he could feel the crowd's energy grow. They were all fighting for a common cause. As the legislation made its way through Congress, James continued to rally support. He reached out to other veterans organizations, schools, and local businesses, encouraging them to join the cause. Community events were held to honor fallen soldiers, and James worked tirelessly to ensure that David's name was never forgotten. Finally, the day came when the legislation was put to a vote. James stood in the gallery of the House, surrounded by fellow supporters. As the results were announced, the chamber erupted in applause. The bill had passed. It was a victory not just for David's family, but for every soldier who had ever been disrespected in death. James was overwhelmed with emotion. He thought about David's life, his sacrifice, and the journey they had taken together to honor that sacrifice. This was a moment of triumph, not just for him, but for all those who had rallied together to fight for respect and dignity. In the weeks that followed, changes began to take place. New policies were implemented to ensure that fallen soldiers were honored appropriately, and the community celebrated their heroes with renewed pride. James felt a deep sense of fulfillment as he saw the impact of their efforts. As he walked through his neighborhood one afternoon, he noticed a small memorial for fallen soldiers had been set up in the park. Flowers were laid at the base, and a sign read, "In honor of our heroes." He felt a swell of gratitude and hope as he realized how far they had come. The movement had transformed not just policies, but hearts and minds. People were learning to appreciate the sacrifices of soldiers, and the community was stronger than ever. James understood that while they had achieved much, there was still work to be done. They needed to continue spreading awareness and ensure that every soldier, past and present, was recognized for their bravery. As he looked at the memorial, he knew David's spirit lived on in this change. The fight for respect and dignity was far from over, but with each step they took, they honored the legacy of every fallen soldier. And together, they would continue to push for justice.